Okay, hi everyone. This is Carol from Cubic. Welcome to join our webinar today. Our topic is global IP strategies during pandemic. And I believe IP is always a very big topic, and especially during this special time, and especially for those companies who is doing cross-border business. So I hope today's sharing will give you more knowledge or insights just to help you to expand your business overseas. And okay, so we will be recording this webinar and you will receive a copy after the event, and everyone will be automatically on mute, but you can still use the chat and Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen and just to type your questions to our panelists. And if you want to speak, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and you will be able to ask. And so for today's agenda, the first 10 minutes will be a quick introduction and 30 minutes presentation and 20 minutes panel discussion and Q&A. Just quickly introduce Cubic. We are a platform for emerging and growing companies for the who want to expand their business to China or establish a business presence in China. And we are basically doing three parts of our services. First is the one-on-one market expansion service. The second is the Shanghai Week program, and the third is the Bridge12 community. And for Bridge12, it is operated by us, Cubic, and the Cambridge Innovation Center, CIC, and is newly launched this year to provide a strong network, mentorship program, and consulting services to unlock the path to China for the companies who is interested in Chinese market. And we have the office space, which is on the 12th floor of 245 Main Street in CIC space, and China advisory service, as well as the community events, just like the webinar we're having now. And here we have our moderator and panelists. Jing is also one of the attendees of our previous programs to China. He is the CEO of ZSFab, and he is doing R&D in the US and also have market in China. So I think he will be the best to be our moderator to explore this topic. And Jennifer is one of our speakers in our Shanghai Week program last year, and she is the vice president and principal of Eagle IP, and she is located in Hong Kong. And Tanny is also one of our speakers in Bridge12 seminar earlier last year, and he is based in Boston, and he is the counsel of Wolf Greenfield. So I think I will move my microphone to Jing, and Jing, you can start a panel from introducing yourself, and Jennifer and Tanny can also introduce yourself, and then we can start. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's my great pleasure to be here. Hi, everybody. I am Jing Zhang, the CEO of ZSFab. Can you go to the next slide?
Okay.
And our company is designated to develop the customized bio implants for patients, and we really invest heavily on our technology. So IP protection is definitely something we care a lot, and it will be a lot of information for this lecture, and we expect to learn more. For myself, I graduated from UIC with my PhD degree in industrial systems engineering, and I got my bachelor and master's degree in Tsinghua University. For me, I have like about 13 years experience in 3D printing, so kind of like a mentor in this field. Now I will give this like talk to Tani for yourself and your company. Oh, Jennifer.
There you go.
You go first. Yeah.
Everyone, I'm Jennifer Che. I am based out of Hong Kong, actually, but I did live in Boston for about 20 plus years, so I'm actually very familiar. I was at Vertex Pharmaceuticals and also at Millennium before that, which is now Takeda, and then more recently was at a flagship startup called Excella, which is I think now a public company, and was head of IP there for a couple of years. And then in 2017, moved to Hong Kong. So now I work at Eagle IP, which is really a firm that does a lot of, helps a lot of companies in the US file for patent protection in China. So, and I'm actually a US patent attorney, so we actually do a lot of kind of blended work, cross-border type work. And yeah, I guess that's, and Tanya and I actually went to law school together, and that's kind of how we met. And we're both from MIT as well, so that's a little bit of our background. Chemistry-ish, chemical engineering. So my background is chemistry originally, and really I guess my area of expertise is pharmaceuticals, biotech. Look forward to talking to you guys about patents and China patent law too. All right, Tani.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Next slide. Thanks. Hi, so I'm Tani Chen. Work at Wolf Greenfield. As Jen said, we actually went to law school together back in the day. Been at Wolf since 2001, so going close to 20 years, practicing in IP law. My practice is generally in chemistry/biotech. My degree's in chemical engineering, but that was in a day where biomedical engineering didn't actually exist as a separate degree, so it was actually part of a chemical engineering degree. My practice generally focuses on early stage technologies, whether it's from a startup company or from a university, those sort of early stage sort of things. As a firm, we actually practice pretty much all forms of IP law. We're a boutique, so we only do IP law. But within that, we'll represent anything between, giant Fortune 500 companies to the very small early stage startup and pre-early stage startup in a lot of cases. And that's where my practice is generally focused. Next slide.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. We see during this beautiful weather, we probably should sit together and talk about the face-to-face. But due to the pandemic, a lot of us, have to stay at home and of course work from home. And a lot of companies are really suffering. But at the same time, a lot of great ideas are pumping out. And people are rushing to get their ideas or their products protected. So Tony, can you tell us how to protect yourselves among all these kind of great ideas that you get the best one?
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. First, I'd start off by just saying kind of where the practice is right now. As a firm, one of the things that happens is when we get new cases that the people ask us to do, we have to send a conflict check to make sure that it doesn't run into something that some other client is doing. And because of that, it's pretty easy to see what new cases coming to the firm are because it gets broadcast to everyone. And roughly speaking, in the last 2 months, about half the conflict checks have either the word COVID-19 or coronavirus somewhere in the conflict check. So there's a lot of activity ongoing right now, and it's a little bit like a gold rush because there's just so much activity involved in everything that you can think of related to coronavirus. Some of it's relating to physical things, so personal protective equipment type applications. Some of it's related to ventilation, ventilators. Some of it's related to vaccines. Some of it's related to different pharmaceutical drugs. But you name it, there's people interested in it right now. So it's creating a little bit of a rush. Everybody's basically saying the same thing. Given the uncertainty, given the number of competitors, we want to file as fast as possible. So I'm going to focus a little bit on, what does that mean, and how do you do this in the right way? The wrong way is basically you take the napkin that this idea was written on and you file a photocopy of the napkin. Right? Yes, you can do it, but it will create a lot of legal problems down the road. And to divide this sort of into two pieces. The first is how do you write the application, how you prepare the application, and the second would be how you actually get the application through the patent office quickly. The process of filing an application in the patent office and going back and forth with an examiner at the patent office to get it allowed, that process is termed prosecution. So that section will be the part where we talk about prosecuting applications. The most important thing to remember in all this is despite the rush, despite all of the urgency, we have to get this filed immediately. I've been told this at least 6 different times that we have to file the application by tomorrow. It doesn't give you a pass to get out of any of the patent laws. All of the patent laws are still in effect. The things that the courts and the patent office will look at are still there, even though you may not have sufficient time to really think through all these things in detail. you don't get a pass on the patent rules. And so that's very important. All the common pitfalls are still going to be in effect. So next slide. So so then the question is, well, what do you need in your patent application? In some sense, the goal of this point isn't necessarily to get all of the claims you necessarily want, which is the full scope of protection you hope to get. Mostly because you don't really have the time to sit down and really figure out all of the claims and all of the different ramifications and all the potential competitors and things like that. Your goal at this point is to get a defendable date by which, at a later point, if you draft claims or you see a competitor doing something, you've got stuff in your application to be able to say, we got there first, we had these ideas first. And so it's important to have all of these ideas fleshed out in a way that you can point to them later on and say, this would support these other claims that we hadn't written at the time, but we were already thinking about. Obviously, the more time you spend thinking about those issues, the longer it's going to take. So now you have to think about the trade-off between how quickly this needs to be done, and how much information you want to get in there. In general, however, can go back. In general, it's probably better to err on the side of putting too much information in rather than too little. If you put too much information in there, you might have things in there that ultimately, you don't find interesting later on. They're not financially important. But if you don't have it in there, you can't add it later. And then if somebody else comes up with the same idea a couple of days later, they have a date before you do. And now at that point, it's a situation you can't fix because you can't get an earlier date. So it's important to err a little bit on the side of just making sure you've got enough information in there that you can start defending all of these ideas that you had. One question I often get asked is, well, gee, we don't have the data yet. We're trying to get the data and the experiment's ongoing, but it's going to take a while. Can you file anything right now? The answer is actually surprisingly yes. There's a section that's known as a prophetic example, which is it's an example that you write that it doesn't actually have data in it, but describes what you think would happen if you did the experiments. They're not as good as real examples, obviously, for two reasons. Number one, you just might be guessing wrong scientifically. And number two, there's some legal systems around the world that don't like them because they're a little bit too theoretical and not tied to reality. And so as a matter of legal principle, they don't like them. But there's other places, such as the US, where they're perfectly acceptable, even if they're a little bit more easy to attack as being, invalid for scientific reasons or whatever not. So it's better than nothing, and it's something to think about, if you're sort of in a rush and you really only have a few days to get something on file. The other thing that I've used in a couple of cases is what I call the staged provisional filings. So typically you file these applications as a provisional, which means you get 1 year in which to update the case, convert it to a more regular utility filing or PCT filing, etc. But what you can do is you don't have to wait the entire year, especially if there's updates coming in, and there might be updates coming in pretty quickly if you have a team of people doing experiments in the lab and learning things, in short order. You can file another provisional application, based on the first one, but including additional data or additional thoughts and things like that. And you might do this 3 or 4 times as the experiments and the data keep rolling in, so that every time you've got a new experiment coming in, you have a priority date for those experiments and you have something you can defend based on that. And at the end of the 1-year anniversary of the first date, then you roll all that stuff together into one application and file that as a single PCT or US utility or so forth. So that's another tactic that can be helpful when you've got a series of experiments ongoing and you have to get protection on all of them. The cost for doing provisional experiments or stage filings is actually not that much, because what you're really doing is you're starting with your existing application and adding to it. So if you're not adding a whole lot, you might be adding maybe 2 pages of additional information. It's not going to cost the same as if you're writing a 50-page application from scratch. It's going to be much, much less. And filing fees for provisionals are usually only a few $100s. So there's a lot of reason to think about this when you're in a very fast-moving area. The last thing I'd say in something like this sort of situation where you're in a real rush situation and the deadlines that matter are primarily being driven by external forces that you have very little control over. There's a lot of experiments going on. There's a lot of people in this space. If you only have between now and Friday to write this patent application, The person who's working on it, the amount of experiments and how quickly they can put together a very comprehensive application is going to start mattering a great deal. You might have somebody who takes takes a month to write a patent application. You might have somebody who can write the same patent application within a week. When you're talking about a matter of days, that can become even more critical. And so having somebody who's very experienced, they might be expensive. They might be charging quite a lot of dollars per hour, but they can generate product very, very fast, and it's going to be something that's going to withstand litigation or high scrutiny and stuff like that. And yet they can get it all done before Friday when you have to get this thing filed. It tends to be more expensive in some sense, but in the long run, it actually might end up being cheaper because you're going to have a higher quality product within the time frame where it had to be delivered. And you're not having somebody who's only been doing this for a year or so who doesn't really understand the nuances and where you can take shortcuts and what things you can leave out and what things you absolutely cannot leave out if you want to maintain your date. And so I would encourage people to not think about who the cheapest person that's writing this application is, but who the best person for the job is, given all of these constraints that you're facing. Next slide. So those are a couple of tips in just terms of writing the application. And I'm assuming a little bit that people have some basic knowledge of patent law. If you don't, I'm happy to answer questions after the presentation. The second part of this to think about is sort of what you do once you get the application on file. So one thing you can do is you can simply file it as a provisional application, wait a year, see if additional data comes in, see how the coronavirus thing turns out. But if you want the application to proceed more quickly at the patent office, then that's sort of the second stage, which is the prosecution part. A couple of days ago, this is actually very, very recent, the US Patent Office issued what they called the COVID-19 Prioritized Examination Pilot Program. And it's a program that's basically specially geared toward people who have COVID-19 products or processes that they want to get through the patent office very, very quickly. There's a number of requirements here. The most important one is probably that it's got to be some sort of product or process that relates to COVID-19 and also requires some level of FDA approval. The patent office listed on what they considered FDA approval a number of different categories, which I've shown here on the slide. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly what all of those entail. As my expertise is in IP, not in FDA law. From the patent side of things, there's a number of other requirements. One of them is that you have to be a smaller micro entity. So they're really trying to help the smaller companies, get cases through the system more quickly. They set a ceiling of 500 cases. So that means once the 500 cases, 500 people have applied to this program, they're gonna end it at that point. So this is something where if you want something to happen, you probably want to go quickly. They promise what's called final disposition within 1 year, possibly within 6 months. Some of the literature was a little unclear exactly what they meant, but I would say at least within a year. Now, the strategic consideration is final disposition doesn't necessarily mean allowance. Final disposition means that they basically give you one of two options, that the examiner decides. Either it's allowable, or they give you what's called a final rejection, which basically means it's a date where they set a date where if you don't have the application allowed by that time, you have to file additional papers in which to keep the application going. But when you do that, it also throws you out of this pilot program, because at that point you've gotten your final disposition and you now have to take additional steps to keep the application on. The strategic consideration is that you want to make it easy for an examiner to say, yeah, this is allowable, and not like this is going to be a mess. I don't have time to deal with this within the next year. I'm going to give you a final rejection now to get it out of the pilot program and back in the normal examination, and then I'll deal with it in the normal course of business. I don't have this huge time crunch on me trying to get this case examined and allowed. So you can certainly file as many claims as you want, up to 30 claims, but that might not be the best way to get the case allowed. The best way might be to think about, what trade-offs that you can do in order to get something, more narrow allowed, but something that an examiner will find very easy to allow. And then in the next case, in a continuation or something like that, you file the broader claims, and you keep things going like that. It's a very strategic consideration. A lot of people don't like to be told, yeah, we're giving up stuff But it is something to consider if your goal is speed rather than breadth. Next slide. Yep. Back one more. In addition to the COVID-19 track, there's actually other mechanisms of speed prosecution. These have always been in existence, but with the announcements of the COVID-19 things, people sometimes forget that these other mechanisms are still in play. The most popular ones, there's a number of them listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but two of them that are probably worth thinking about is one is what's called track one examination. It's a very similar process to the COVID-19 track, but it's not limited to any particular technology. And so if you have a technology that's valuable, but might not necessarily require FDA approval. So for example, a new protective gown or something like that huge market opportunity for, you could still use track one examination and get it through the system more quickly. Another one that I often try to remember to remind my clients is that there's a petition to make special on the basis of age. If one of your inventors is over 65 years old, that's a reason to get to the head of the line. And all you have to do is just demonstrate that you have an inventor over 65 years old. There's not all of this, I have to show it's in this technology field or that technology field. You just basically need the driver's license or something like that. And that's enough to get you to the head of the line. So that's a very quick way to get things going more quickly as well. Next slide. A couple of suggestions to maximize protection. In the U.S., there's a very limited grace period. There's sometimes you'll hear about a 1-year grace period in the U.S. It's not as broad as it used to be because of something called the American Defense Act that was passed a number of years ago. And if you're interested in places like Europe or China, they don't have a grace period, and so you really need to file as quickly as you can. In a lot of these kind of things, you have to file. I was just filing provisional, and then you can follow it with PCTs or other things. The important thing is to think about is to try to put in as many workarounds and foreseeable developments to your technology as you can, because you are trying to do something that's very comprehensive in a very tight race situation. You don't have a lot of time to come up with these options, but the more you can put in there, the more viable your patent will be, because you have more opportunities to prevent and exclude competitors from coming into spaces that you care about. So those are the kind of things where you have to think about, how much time and how much energy do I want to spend doing this, and hopefully you're working with a good patent lawyer that can help you on these things, versus the need to get these things on file as fast as possible. I think that's it for my part of the talk.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. It's really helpful for us to save money, especially some things you just mentioned. But as you mentioned, it's very important not only to save money in the beginning, but also save money in the later. We want to save bigger money. And we also know that it is a faster track for us to apply for the patents if that is heavily related with the COVID ID, either cure or kind of prevention. And we also know that recently there was a hot debate regarding the Wuhan Virology Institute, that they filed a patent application regarding to this drug, remdesivir, and we know that it was actually patented by Gilead. And the pharmaceutical companies, they heavily invest in their IP protection. So we wanted to know how could this be possible, and what does it mean if someone already have a patent in one application or in one category? Is there anything we can do with another category in another field? So Jennifer, can you give us more upon this topic? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ding. So it's funny, when this news first came out, actually, I had multiple friends send me a message, just out of the blue, actually, saying, "Did you hear about this news? How can they do that? How can China be stealing America's IP?" And then I had to sort of explain, and it's hard to explain in just one sentence, actually. So I will spend a couple slides sort of explaining, because it's a little nuanced why they can do this or whether they can. So let's go back to legal concepts about why or whether they will be able to do what they're trying to do. So next slide, please. All right, so these are the facts. There's the molecule, remdesivir. So it's true. Gilead invented remdesivir, the molecule, years ago. They were developing it originally for this paramyxoviridae, a certain type of virus. And then they also were testing it for Ebola when Ebola happened, but it didn't work so well. So it was sort of this drug that was on their shelf, and they were testing it for different things. And then several years later, actually, they filed patent applications for its use on treating coronavirus infections. They listed SARS, MERS, whatnot. So all this stuff, all this patent activity happened starting around 2010, 2011, all the way, and it's still going on now, actually. It's not over yet. They're still working on these patent applications that they kept filing, different uses, different whatevers. So the big news is in January 21st, 2020, Wuhan Institute of Virology put out a press release and said, we filed for a Chinese patent on the use of remdesivir for treating COVID-19. The patent application has just been filed, so it is not public. None of us know what claims they filed. None of us know what the application looks like. We don't know what's in there, right? So all we know is that they announced that they did. So we'll just have to assume they did. So the question is that okay? So let's go 2 slides forward, actually, because I have a repeat slide. So I'm just going to skip that repeat slide for now. Just go 2 forward onto the sort of deeper facts about Gilead. So you can skip this one. We'll come back to that for sure. All right, so let's look at, so we know what Wuhan Institute did. So let's first look at what was already known and what activities have been happening up until that point. So we understand sort of just the landscape of this area. So as I mentioned before, Gilead filed multiple patent applications, and I don't even have all of them here. I just put some key important ones. They filed for composition of matter claims. That literally means they own the molecule for whatever purpose. So if you take the molecule, you make it, you use it, you sell it, it doesn't matter. You have infringed Gilead's patent, okay? That's basically what this composition of matter claim gives you. They then went ahead a few years later and found out that it worked pretty well for arenaviridae, coronaviridae. So then they filed another patent application on the use of treating arenaviridae and then coronaviridae too, actually. And last year, they were prosecuting arenaviridae claims because I guess that was important to them. And they got that granted last year. And then they started to pursue these coronaviridae claims. And interestingly, it just got allowed like in April, like last month. And that patent will now grant in June of 2020. Gilead's method of treating coronaviruses. And in those claims, they have included SARS, MERS, you know, I think there are 6 known coronaviruses before COVID-19. So these are probably this corona thing.
Okay, here.
Did we lose our signal?
Jane? Yeah, are we losing Jane?
So when we think about, you know, what do I own? What can one person do? Can they do that? Who's stealing from what? We have to understand 2 really important patent law concepts. So let's go on to the next slide. Next slide. Thanks. So first of all, there's patentability and there's freedom to operate. These are 2 separate concepts and they coexist, but they don't necessarily impact each other. Okay, so let me explain what that means. So patentability really is, can Wuhan Institute of Virology get a patent? That's it. They filed for a patent. Can they own IP? Okay, can they own what they're claiming that they own? And the way you evaluate that is you look to see whether it's novel, whether it's inventive, and then whether their application is sufficiently described. So if we look back at what Gilead had already filed, first of all, we have to think about, is it novel? Well, you know, COVID-19 is literally a novel disease. It's called the new coronavirus in Chinese, actually. It is literally new. It never existed before, or if it did, nobody knew about it. So there's no way that Gilead has a claim or has filed on the use of their drug for treating COVID-19, because COVID-19 is a new disease. So by definition, it is novel. It is a new invention. Use of an old drug for treating a new disease is novel. Okay, so they're novel. So the second standard they have to overcome is inventiveness. So inventiveness is a little trickier. And honestly, I think Tani and I both in our daily lives, we deal with this like 90% of the time, right? We get a rejection and it's almost always about inventiveness because it's about what's around you, how close is it, is what we're trying to patent, is it inventive enough? Is it not obvious, essentially? So this is really an analysis, it's case by case. We don't know right now what Wuhan Institute has filed exactly. Are they literally just saying use of Gilead's drug for treating COVID-19? Or is it more specific than that? Is it a particular dose? Is it a particular formulation? We don't know. But we all have to think about this. And the standard is really what one of skill in the art. So these would be other scientists who are working in the field, maybe your fellow, people, scientists, essentially. If they knew that Gilead's drug worked for a coronavirus, would they think that it's obvious that it would work for a new coronavirus? And, maybe on its face, I would argue, maybe, because they claimed all 6, and there's only 6. So if a new one comes along, the odds are it would work, I guess, right? So that's one argument. But different are, look at the way they're impacting the patients, look at the percentage of, the R0 factor of how it's being spread, look at the mechanism, look at the shape of the coronavirus, it's completely different. There's no way it would be the same. And if they can show data that actually shows that, look, we actually can treat this coronavirus 10 times better than we can treat SARS, MERS, and whatever, then they have a pretty good argument, actually, that they came up with something that wasn't obvious. Okay, so at the end of the day, we don't know whether they can get a patent, but there is a reasonable chance, I will say, and maybe even greater than 50% chance that they can get some sort of patent on the use of remdesivir for treating COVID-19 in some form or fashion, whether it's a particular dose or whether it's just directly just that claim. We don't know, but yes, they can potentially get a patent, okay? So that's patentability. And it doesn't matter that Gilead owns earlier patents because this invention is new. So they own this invention, okay? Yes? Jane, did you say something?
Yeah, your connection was cut again. Sometimes it does like a few seconds. Yeah.
Oh, shoot. Yeah. What did you miss?
Just like 2 seconds ago. It's okay. You can go on. That's the. I will mention you next time if you are cutting for a long time.
Okay, thank you so much. I will summarize what I said, which is essentially for patentability, the invention that at Wuhan is filing is very possibly patentable if they were the first people to file on that combination, if they have data to show it. It's possible. We don't know because it really comes down to the data and sort of what it looks like compared to what's already known. So that's the standard. So then the other aspect of this, and this is what makes people so upset, I think, is because does Wuhan Institute of Virology have the freedom to operate? Freedom to operate means, are there any other patents that cover what I'm going to be doing? And this is where the answer very well may be no. And how do you determine that? You have to look at the claim scope of the issued patents that are already existing. You have to look at the jurisdiction, see where these patents are. So let's say, next slide. Let's take a look at this. Great. Oh, wait. Okay, so these are the claims. I have the US claims since we're speaking and reading in English here. And, but for the sake of, argument, we'll say these are the claims. You can see that the compound patent that Gilead has literally just claims the compound for remdesivir. That means, as I said earlier, if Wuhan Institute wants to make, use, or sell remdesivir for whatever reason, including COVID-19, they can't because Gilead owns the molecule for use for everything. So you love composition of matter claims because it means you own the product for all uses. These are the best types of claims to get. If you've invented a novel product or composition, you want to patent it full out, not limited by what it can do or how it works or whatever like that. Just literally the structure. This is it. I own this. I don't care. So in that sense, yes, Wuhan cannot practice using the molecule because Gilead owns a patent on the molecule. Furthermore, Gilead also owns a patent on a method for treating a coronavirus infection in a human. What might Wuhan want to do? They might want to sell remdesivir for treating COVID-19. Is COVID-19 a coronavirus? Yes. it's true that they didn't list COVID-19, but coronavirus is a class of coronaviruses, right? So in that sense, there's an argument to be made that Gilead has at least 2 patents that cover what Wuhan Institute might want to do with their own patent. So in this situation, you have a funny situation where Wuhan Institute may own a patent on Gilead's drug, but Gilead owns the drug and the use of it for treating generally coronaviruses. What happens to that invention of using remdesivir for treating coronavirus if they both get a patent? It means they have to license, essentially. One can't practice without the other for treating COVID-19. So finally, in this light, there is one potential thing that could happen, and that is the last slide, is that the government may actually decide to provide and give a compulsory license. Next slide, please. Uh-oh, okay, there we go, yes. So essentially, most of the major countries around the world had signed a treaty. It's called TRIPS. And as part of the TRIPS agreement, it's a trade-related IP agreement, essentially. They've agreed on, harmonizing a bunch of IP, but they've also agreed on this interesting issue, which is that if your country has a national emergency or, has certain, there are reasons sometimes that a government can decide to grant a compulsory license to certain IP, even if the patentee does not want to give a license. They may force it. So I would say one example that almost happened in the US was when anthrax happened, and there was this huge fear that everybody would be dying. And there was a patent on a drug that could be used to treat anthrax. And at the time, the government seriously considered, because the patentee could not manufacture it fast enough, they could basically give the patent rights to a generic and let the generic help manufacture it so that there would be enough drug to go around. And they just have to pay a fair price to the patentee. They don't even have to ask for permission. So if China decides that Gilead's drug is important enough for national health or whatever it is, they can use this and actually grant a license without Gilead's permission to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And similarly, the US could do the same thing if it were the other way around. So, so that's, again, this has never been done. The US or China, I don't think either country has ever invoked this clause because it needs to be such an emergency to kind of impose on someone's patent rights. But we're in a really weird world right now. So anything can happen, I feel like, with the coronavirus because it's just, everything's unprecedented. So who knows? But for now, I mean, that is essentially something that could happen. So I think I'm almost out of time. Maybe in 1 minute, I'll just go to maybe do a 2 slides forward. I'll give a few China practice tips. That was kind of the other half of my talk. I figured if I had time, I'll just quickly go through a few patent practice tips for if you do want to pursue patent protection in China. There are some differences in the law between China and the US. Next slide. Next one. All right, so I'll just give 4 quick tips. One, I think if you've ever worked on Chinese patents, you will know that data is absolutely the most important, especially if you're in life science. Essentially, working examples that cover the whole scope of your claim is really of paramount importance, and it's because the China Patent Office is just really strict in this way. So that's essentially just something to watch out for, I would say. Patent eligibility rules in China are a little bit different than the US. For example, a method of treating diseases or diagnosing diseases you're not allowed to get patents on that. They don't want you to sue doctors. Also though, interestingly, any inventions that violate law, social ethics, harms the public interest, according to China's kind of societal values. So, maybe it's a gun and it shoots and kills people. Maybe it's nuclear weapons. Maybe it's pornography. What are these inventions that China considers to violate social ethics? You may not be able to get a patent on that. A lot of people worry about enforceability and whether patents in China are worth anything. I will say the short answer is yes. I understand that there's concerns, but there's a lot of new developments. I have no time to go into it today, but I have several presentations on developments that are happening very, very quickly and recently. And even the trade agreement has a lot of IP terms that I think people in the life sciences will be really interested in knowing. Things like patent term adjustment, patent term extension are all being added to the Chinese patent law. So finally, things that trip up people sometimes, I think. If you have, let's say, a lab in China, inventions made in China actually need to be filed in China first. You cannot file a US provisional on the invention made in China. You will get in trouble. So if you actually absolutely want to file in the US, then you would need to get a security clearance in China. And it goes both ways. The US is the same way. So I think people just need to be mindful of that. And then, yeah, I won't even talk about the last one because it'll take a few minutes. I'm a little over time. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time. Happy to go on to the next section, I guess. Yeah, we can chat.
Thank you, Jane. Now it's the time for open discussions. So we will go through these questions, and our audience, if you have questions, you can raise up your hand and we'll unmute you and then you raise up your question. How do I file now?
And if anyone who wants to just type the questions, you can also just type in the Q&A button. And maybe Jane, you can just read that out and ask our panelists.
Yeah, sure. So how do I file now with maximum protection in very short time frame while keeping all my options open? So Tani, Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on that, earlier in the talk, but I guess what I would say for that is that in a lot of cases, the most important thing is to start writing all these ideas down and trying to document them, and then give them to a patent lawyer to turn that into a patent application. Patent lawyers by themselves can only do so much. We are not inventors. We are the ones whose job it is to assist the inventors and help them reach their full potential. But if you don't have an invention, there's only so much that we can do, without that invention. So it often starts with asking the inventors the hard questions of, how does this work? How are all the different ways you can use it? How are ways to modify it? What are people going to do as they understand this idea? And just have that dialogue going and be able to document all that so that you can put that into the application. Because if you don't ask your inventors that question, your competitors are going to be basically asking the exact same question. That's how they figure out how to get around your patents. So you've got to get there first, and you have a very short time frame in which to do that. You don't have to fill in the full set of claims based on that, but you at least have that documentation in the patent application.
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, of course, budget is always an issue, and the more budget you have, the more flexibility you have, because the beauty of sort of provisionals is that you can file 100 provisionals and abandon half of them. So if you don't know what's going to work, you just kind of keep the provisionals that work and kind of combine them together and file, let's say, one non-provisional. The problem if you put them all in one application is that if you want to keep some of it, that whole thing becomes publicly available. So you can't hide stuff later as trade secrets. So I would say if you want to keep options open, you actually divide stuff up. So you're like, these are potential trade secrets, but I don't know yet, but I need to file in case somebody else files. Money, I would say you can file a lot of provisionals. They're not expensive, so you could always just not draft claims and just get this, like Tanya said, just get the stuff in there, and it doesn't have to be pretty, right? Just file it. Right.
But I say my record is filing 10 provisionals on the same day, for the same client, doing exactly what Jen said. We had all these different ideas. We weren't sure which ones we were going to go forward with, and we filed 10 different cases on the same day.
I think I've done 6 or 7, very similar, yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure very helpful. Our company actually did the same thing. It's much faster, and as you said, it's really well protected. And
right.
As we see, like so many companies, they are maybe rushing for the same idea. And you mentioned that we have to keep very good documentation. But let's see, when in a case that you really need to propose that you are the first one, what kind of document is necessary? How do you keep it, like electronically, like by paper, or like by publication, or whatever? So what do you think about this for the first inventor to file?
Don't publish.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and in a lot of countries, I know Europe is this way, and Jen, you can opine on China, but they don't really care what documentation you have ahead of time. They only care about what reaches the patent office first. So it's this race to the patent office kind of system. The U.S. has a couple other options available, and so that's where the good record note keeping and that sort of thing becomes very important. Electronic notebooks are a thing where they're highly debated in the U.S. right now. Just because pretty much anybody is like, well, as soon as somebody produces an electronic notebook, the other side says, well, you just cook the dates to make that happen, right? And there's not a lot of litigation or best practice in terms of what makes a good electronic notebook. So it's very much a wild west right now in terms of what that is. There's some cases where we're still recommending people to just use paper notebooks and stuff like that, because the law on that and how you defend a paper notebook on court is much better than how you defend an electronic notebook.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I guess you could use emails as well, if you want to email stuff to yourself, or like if there's servers that people trust as record keeping, like Microsoft Office, maybe people trust Microsoft or something like that. Yeah, but it is good to keep records, even though the US is now also technically like first to file. You could at least argue that somebody maybe stole your invention, right? Let's say you shared it with some other friend, and then the friend went and filed, but you had actually shared it with a friend and you wrote it down earlier. Then you've got evidence, in a sense, even though your friend filed first, that maybe your friend stole it. So it's always a good idea to keep these good notebooks, even though the US is also, in a sense, it is a race to the patent office as well.
Right. Okay. One of the things that we told people when the AIA went into effect is that this doesn't obviate the need for really good record keeping in yes. the in your scientific notebooks and things like that. All of the best practices we told you before still apply.
That was the most common question. It was like, does that mean I don't have to keep notebooks anymore? Like, no, no.
Okay, it's really important to know that, and it seems like in China you have to go to the patent office to first file for it, right? Okay.
I mean, it's that way both places. China's a little interesting in that, inventorship and all these concepts are not nearly as important in some ways, because in China, the law itself actually says by law, an employer owns the inventions of its employees, as long as the employer was working for the employer, being paid and doing work that's, consistent with what he was basically hired to do. Sort of like a work for hire concept in US copyright. So in China, it kind of doesn't matter if you're an inventor, actually, because you don't even have to sign an assignment. Like if you work for so-and-so company, it just belongs, and we can file it under the applicant and nobody cares. I think that's a difference. And I was, that was the part of my talk I didn't talk about, but I can talk about it a little bit here, which is if you do have labs, in China and you're hiring employees, these employer laws are quite strong, and they actually reach beyond after the employer leaves the company. So you don't want to hire someone who was competing in the same space, because if that employee is working in the scope of what he was hired to do, in 1 year later, the company owns the IP by law. So if you hire an employee that is working, let's say in the exact same field, on the same, let's say molecule even, of course, maybe you're hoping that you can use their expertise, but at the same time, if it's literally the same work that we're doing before, actually by law, the former company owns that IP. So you have to be very careful when you hire employees in China, especially if they're going to be inventing, because you don't even know if you legally can own the IP as an employer, because it might be in the field of what their former employer was doing.
Oh, that is interesting to know. So what if you have signed up kind of like a waivement? Okay, the employee promised that they have no connection with the previous company, and does your company get protected? Because you may really invest a lot of money in the new ideas, and eventually find that it belongs to others.
I think that's a very good practice, and that is something I've done in the past. When I worked for a company that was essentially setting up an office, or not an office, a lab in China, they actually had each Chinese employee basically sign a document listing all the IP.
Hi, Jen. This time we really...
So whatever.
So you said asking the employees to send the list something, and then we cut down.
List sort of what IP they have invented, I guess if it's public, of course, and then kind of assuring that there's no conflict, they're working in an area that is different from what they did before. And that's just a nice practice to do, actually. You're worried about IP that you might not own.
Right, perfect. So the third question seems to be something we talked about, and it really occurs. And maybe like you can give a really short briefing about this.
Yeah, so Jen actually mentioned compulsory licensing in China. I can also chime in with the US perspective.
Yes.
Which is interesting. So I think there have been 6 or 7 times where people have tried to to invoke compulsory licensing in the U.S. Every single one of them has failed. Most of them, I think all of them, were via the NIH and via certain drugs and the patents that covered the drugs, and people wanted to, invoke the compulsory licenses. I think the first one was an AIDS drug or something like that. The talk sort of around the water cooler is that, if it comes up again, this might be the situation which allows for compulsory licensing for the first time in the U.S. As Jen said, this is completely unprecedented. It's obvious national emergency. It's hard to think of a situation more extreme than what we're going right now for the government to decide that this is the time to break somebody's patent and force a compulsory license. So the people are, everybody's kind of betting in the patent world that this is going to happen at some point once some drug gets identified as being sort of the cure for all of this. So that wouldn't surprise me if something like that happened. But at this point, it's never happened before, so we don't know exactly what shape or form this is going to take and how extensive the compulsory license is or anything like that. It's completely unknown at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe in that kind of situation, profit for the company is not our first concern. We really concern something much, much bigger.
Yeah, I mean, right. The goal is to try to get this drug to be produced faster, and if the company, whoever happened to own the patent, can't make drug fast enough,
right.
We could easily see the U.S. government stepping in and making sure that generics can produce the drug too, because it's a national emergency. We're all locked down because of this thing. This would be the situation that you would argue is the situation that allows you to invoke the compulsory licensing clauses.
I think so. It very well could happen.
Yeah, we still have a few open questions to go through, and our audience, you can ask questions in Q&A or raise your hand. Can we go to next slide? So how do I minimize spending in view of future uncertainty in funding, especially like startups? We really care about money. Cash is our blood, and when cash is gone, basically we are died. So we want to get more IP protected, and we want to save money. What do you suggest?
Tony, you must be used to having to deal with problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of one answer for regular, startup companies, and there's sort of the ones we're in now, which have to do with coronavirus. Which unfortunately is the most important thing is getting those stakes in the ground. You have to build a foundation. So, in a case like this, you do have to spend the time and money to make sure you've got the strong foundation for your IP, and then you basically skimp on everything else. So I always liken it to if you're trying to build a house, you need to make sure that foundation is rock solid, but then you don't build anything on the foundation. So you file everything as provisional. You wait to the PCT, and then you file one PCT that covers just the pieces that you care about. If you have multiple provisionals, you pick a relatively cheap prosecution through the PCT. You don't respond to anything, and then by the time you get to the point where you have to make some really hard decisions, you're 30 months in and looking at national phase and deciding which countries you want to go into. But the key to doing that right is going to be in spending the time up front and making sure that original application has all the pieces in it that you're going to need later on. And so that's that firm foundation that you have to have. If you start skimping on that, you save money now, but then you end up spending a lot more money down the road trying to fix it. I've had a few cases that were transferred in from other firms where, like the amount of money I ended up spending on, there's one case where it came to about almost $50,000, and it was like $50,000 to fix what basically amounted to trying to save a few $100s in the provisional way back when. It was a horrendous, there was horrendous things in terms of what wasn't disclosed, or horrendous problems in terms of who didn't sign the necessary documents to show ownership in the company. And yeah, you save $3,000 back in the day, and now I'm spending $50,000 to fix the mess that they made. So, there's companies which are like, they think of that as a good option, but ultimately in the long run, it destroys the credibility of the company, and doesn't really do a whole lot on the financial side.
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe minimizing is the wrong word. It really is kind of, what do I invest in? And like Tani said, the foundation is really important. All startups have money, right, for R&D. So at the end of the day, why not just set aside a percentage and say, if I'm going to be investing in R&D because I want to make a product, if I don't protect it, well, it doesn't matter how good my R&D is, right? It's not going to be useful. So as long as you just commit yourself to spending a percentage, then you're just at least going to be consistent all the way through, and you will make sure that you give the amount of R&D money that you spend kind of the fair value of IP. And if you don't have that much money, fine. your R&D is going to go down, and then you won't spend that much on IP. But to like wait till the end, like it's too late because there's a lot of deadlines, and then by then you can't go back and add stuff because it's too late. There's filing dates and stuff.
We have a question from the audience, and it's related with the IP protection from the company. Let's see, he said, I'm working in the company and all my knowledge is related in this field. So if I leave this company, I want to do some related work and I may do a startup. How do I make sure, like what I do with my effort is not totally belongings of the previous company? So what do you suggest?
This is really tricky because there's confidential information that the company owns. You absolutely cannot disclose that to another company because it's the company's confidential information, period, full stop. I mean, there's things like I learned how to, run this column better. I don't know, there's techniques, of course, that you learn. And I think that's different. You can argue it's maybe not confidential information, but there's a lot of know-how that you probably have learned related to your former company. And you have to be super careful about that because every employment agreement has a clause that says you must not disclose your confidential information. I think it's tricky. And, I would say that if you're joining a new company and you see a project that is so close that you cannot help but know that your knowledge is going to influence the direction of the project, you should remove yourself from that project. And I've gone from one biotech company to another one in very close spaces. And I have removed myself from patent applications where the molecule looked a little too close to a molecule that I had worked on. And I knew the pockets, I knew what worked. I cannot be, I'm conflicted out. And I think most people hopefully will have a sense of knowing what is proper and what's not. It's tricky and I can't say there's black and white, but I think in your gut, if you just kind of feel like it's wrong, you're probably right, hopefully.
Okay, so it's really tricky and maybe this audience, you can consult a lawyer regarding your detailed questions.
Actually, that would be a lot safer, at least to show that you've made a good faith effort to try to find out. And then at least you're not willfully doing it. I think that's a super good idea to show that you're not willfully doing it. Courts are very harsh on people who willfully do bad things in general. Super harsh.
Yeah. We have another question. If my target markets are the US and the Chinese market, is it better to file in Hong Kong or I should still file in the US and China at the same time?
It is jurisdictional. So Hong Kong is actually a separate jurisdiction from China and the US. So a Hong Kong patent literally just stops Hong Kongers from using your patent. So if it's COVID related, we don't have that many cases right now. So actually it wouldn't be super useful. So definitely if your market's China and the US, do file in China and the US. Hong Kong, you may not even need to file in unless if you want to. But also Hong Kong itself, actually, you can actually get a Hong Kong patent through a Chinese patent or through a British patent or through a European patent. So you don't actually need to file directly in Hong Kong. You can, but you don't have to. You can also just get a Chinese patent and kind of register it in Hong Kong. So.
Okay. We have one more question. For digital health companies, how to make sure algorithm data is well protected? As we said, it's kind of difficult, but how?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it'll depend a lot on the algorithms and the data. The biggest thing I always worry about when I talk about these sort of things, before you even get to the patent are the more practical aspects of, how do you know you're gonna be able to protect this thing that you have, given how easy it is to copy things in the digital world. It's much more difficult to copy a drug and learn how to manufacture it. It could take months and months of R&D. Lots of employees, right? You can copy stuff by just downloading it from iTunes and hacking into it. And so the question is, even if you get all the protection you ever want on this thing, is this going to be enough to keep other people from coming into this market? Or are you going to have to basically sue every single person that comes in? And if it's 50 different companies and each of them is like 2 people, you could be spending millions of dollars on lawsuits just to keep a couple of people out of the market. But if you don't do that, then you get overrun. So those are the sort of things that the first think about before you even think about how do I protect the patents. And then there's another discussion on terms of whether software is in fact patentable or not. It's at least another 1 hour talk to discuss whether that is. Some people have the impression that software is never patentable. The more correct answer is it depends, and it's probably something that you'd want to talk to an IP lawyer about in details, because depends what kind of software and how it functions and a lot of other things.
It definitely can depend on the law, is the short answer, I think, actually, especially if it's tied to hardware. So, and the law is actually getting friendlier, I would say, in that respect. So it's definitely worth consulting someone about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have one more question from the audience. And it says a lot of companies are having VIE structures. So they may have branch in China, in the US. And you mentioned that if you have this invention first developed in the US, you have to file in US. But this can be done together by their own team. How do you handle this kind of IP protection?
This can be what's the last sentence?
Yeah, so this kind of patent or the invention can be developed by the team cooperated between US and China.
Correct.
So how do you apply it first in the US or do you apply it first in the China company?
You can choose either one, but you just have to ask for permission from the other one. So if you want to file in China, you have to ask the US for permission. So essentially, you just have to get a foreign filing license in order to file. And basically, at least so that's really the way to do it. And the thing is, these things take time. So China is between 2 to 4 weeks, maybe. So if you're in a hurry and you want to file a provisional, but you can't because you just found out that one of your inventors is in China, now you're gonna have to submit this application, request to the Chinese government and wait 4 weeks for them to approve. It's really cumbersome. So it's really good to kind of think about these things earlier, because you could really get in trouble. Because essentially, if you don't, then you can never get a Chinese patent. That's China's patent. That's what China says, essentially. If you ignore this, you have a Chinese inventor, you invented this in China, but yet you filed in the US first, then you will never be able to do national phase into China. We will not let you get a patent. So it's pretty strong consequences if you don't do this right.
Yeah,
that's interesting. It's actually more strict than the US, the US model. There are a few ways to get retroactive licenses, but in general, it's not a great idea to do that. The US also has a very similar system where you have to apply for, if you want to apply in China, you have to get a foreign filing license, through the US Patent Office first in order to be able to file first in China. Like Jen said, I would encourage companies to do that. Go through the process, with a U.S. patent attorney or whatever, to make sure that all that's done the right way, so you don't run into trouble with the U.S. system, for similar reasons. The penalties aren't as drastic, but they're still severe enough that you need to take them seriously.
Yeah, so this company really need to be well prepared. Otherwise, you may get your protected IP nullified.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, I think we are near the end of the panel. Do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think that's all questions.
Okay, great. We really appreciate this knowledgeable information from our two panelists, and it's really helpful. As a startup company, I'm learning a lot, and for the IP protection, I think we will cooperate more. And I think you have your contact information there, and Carol will share our recorded video to our audience in case people are more interested of these questions. We don't have time to detail.
Yes, thank you very much, Jane, and thank you, Tanny, thank you, Jennifer. And this is truly a very wonderful sharing. And if any of our audience who want to get in contact with our moderator or panelists, you can just send email to the email address on the screen. And also, if you want to contact us, the Cubic and Bridge12, you can also email us. And so I think that's everything for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A good one.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
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 Okay.